Hello and welcome to dentReviews. Tonight I want to do something a little bit different than normal, and I want to have a discussion about something that's important to me, a topic I think is relevant to everyone in the population, but specifically to people who listen to and really want to enjoy music. And that is the topic of hearing loss. Now hold on a second, don't run away just yet. I know people scoff at that and they think, oh, hearing loss, that's not going to happen to me, or you're making a big deal out of something. I don't hear anything, I'm 30 years old and I'm fine. Just hear me out. Hearing loss, I think, is a lot more prevalent and a lot more dangerous than most people think, but it's also not that difficult to avoid in most situations. So let's go through a couple things, talk about what hearing loss is and possible ways to prevent it, and hopefully we can continue to all enjoy music for the rest of our lives. So what is hearing loss? Just a quick summary. Inside the cochlea of your ear is a series of hair follicles, and those tiny, very sensitive hairs. Those sensitive hairs are designed in a way that sound waves cause them to vibrate. When they vibrate, those signals from the vibrating hair go into nerves, and those nerves transmit the signal to your brain, and your brain receives those signals and perceives them as sound. Now, each of those hair follicles is representative of different frequencies. So what happens is, when you have a hair follicle that is either damaged due to loud sound exposure that physically damages that hair follicle, or a medical condition, or perhaps side effects of a medicine, or perhaps, a problem with your ear, like an ear infection, any of those things can cause damage to those hair follicles. And when those hair follicles or those hairs die or become damaged, they no longer vibrate and they no longer send signals to your brain for those specific frequencies. And that's why you can lose high frequencies and frequencies in the vocal range. And it's very easy for that to happen. Another thing that can happen with hearing loss, you've probably heard of something called tinnitus or tinnitus. The official organization of tinnitus refers to it as tinnitus, so I'm going to use that pronunciation. But tinnitus is something that when those hair cells or hair follicles die, sometimes you'll get a ghost input or a leakage of sound from that dead hair into the nerve into your brain, and you hear what a lot of people would describe as a ringing, or some people hear a humming or a thumping, and there's lots of different ways that it manifests itself, but you're hearing something that's not really there. And for some people that can be an occasional nuisance. For others it can really detract from people's life and be a constant distraction and irritation. And I pray that no one watching this channel has to deal with that. And if you do, I have sympathy for you, and I just pray that we can do the best we can to protect the hearing that you have left and reduce any further damage. So, to start out, let's talk about decibels. Decibels is just the unit of measurement that determines how loud something is, the sound pressure of a given noise. And you'll see a lot of different decibel charts, decibel ratings, and they have a lot of different kind of common things you'd hear in real life. For instance, 20 to 30 decibels is considered like a whisper, like this. As you get louder, 30 to 40, 50, 60, 70 is things like, office noise and maybe inside of your car on the highway and things like that. And as you get louder than that, it starts to become like power tools and lawnmowers, and you start to get into the 80s and 90 decibels, and then you start to have much louder sounds like motorcycles and chainsaws. And then you get higher than that, you have concerts, music concerts, and you have trains and you have subways. And as you get higher than that, you have things like gunshots and rocket ships and just very, very loud noises. And you can look online. I'll try to post a chart here so you can kind of see different decibel ratings and what they relate to. But what that is important for is to kind of get a gauge of how loud things in the real world are, like things that you hear every day, and where do they sit on that scale. And of course it depends on how far you are from them and the acoustic environment you're in, but just in general, to familiarize yourself with things that you hear and roughly how loud those things are. So that's a very important first step, is to just familiarize yourself. Once you have that, the second thing you can do is you can look at the time exposure. So hearing loss is considered cumulative, and it's considered to start after a certain amount of exposure at a certain level of decibels. In other words, if you were to hear something at 90 decibels. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that is 2 hours of sound that you can hear at that level before you have hearing loss start. At 85 decibels, it's about 4 hours. And if you look at a chart, what you'll notice is decibels and hearing loss threshold are not linear. What I mean by that is if you were to take a decibel rating of a whisper, 20 decibels, 30 decibels, and then increase it 10 decibels, it's not a little bit louder, it's twice as loud. So from 80 decibels to 83 decibels is twice as loud. For 83 to 86 is twice as loud, roughly speaking. So a little increase in decibels is a large increase in volume, perceived volume. So that affects exposure time directly, because if you go from 85 decibels, which is about 4 hours of exposure or maybe 8 hours of exposure depending on situation, going up to 90 decibels or like 87 decibels, somewhere around there, the time of exposure is cut in half. So you've only gone up a few decibels, but now you can only listen to that sound for half the amount of time. By the time you get into the hundreds, 100 to 105 decibels, we're talking about minutes of exposure before you have hearing loss. If you go up into the 120, 130, we're talking about less than a minute, if not seconds, of hearing loss. If you go up above 140, 150, 160 decibels, you're talking about possibly instantaneous hearing loss. 140 decibels is pretty much the threshold of human hearing ability without severe hearing damage, practically instantaneous. So I'll put another chart up here, hopefully, if you saw this, with the different time exposure limits for hearing loss. I may have said some of those incorrectly, but it doesn't really matter. The point is just that you have a general idea of what is safe and how long is safe. Now, I can tell you right now, generally speaking, 85 decibels is relatively safe. Unless you're sitting in an office for 12 hours straight listening to a nonstop 85 decibel noise source, you're probably going to be fine. But if you're in an environment where you're working for 4 hours at 100 decibels, that's not so safe. And that cumulative sound buildup will cause hearing loss. Now, you might not notice the hearing loss. I have people in my life that I've, cared about, that I've tried to warn about hearing certain loud sounds in their daily activities, and they perceive it as, it's not hurting me immediately. They don't have any kind of instantaneous pain or notice of hearing loss or even ringing in their ears, so they just associate that with, I'm fine. Whereas the accumulation of that sound over time will increase their chances, if not guarantee, that they will have hearing loss. So to familiarize yourself with these numbers of, general sense of the decibels and what they associate with in real life sound, and then the exposure time and what that is associated with in terms of hearing loss, is the first and most important step. So once you do that, you'll notice that there's a lot of things in life that people take hearing loss for granted in. Maybe not everybody, but certainly the majority of people neglect hearing loss prevention in a lot of different common hobbies. Riding a motorcycle, shooting a firearm, riding the subway every day to work, listening to music in their car, going to rock concerts. These things are all guaranteed sources of hearing loss. Take, for instance, a rock concert. Most concerts, even with just kind of standard music, not even loud metal, but just regular pop rock music, most concerts are well above 100 decibels. Some very high into the 115, maybe even 120 decibels, depending on the proximity that you are to the speakers, the PA system, the acoustic environment you're in, the crowd noise with the music. It can get very loud very quickly. And as you saw, the amount of time before you reach that threshold to start having hearing loss is very low at that range. So what do? Well, obviously, apart from not going to a concert in the first place, you have hearing protection, earplugs. Now, most people aren't going to wear over-the-ear muffs, so you usually are relegated to earplugs. Most people would, pick up something like this. It's just a Mack's, I think, foam earplug. This is 33 decibels of attenuation. That's about as good as you can get for a foam in-ear plug. That would take a 120 decibel concert down to 90 decibels. Which is a much more manageable level, which is about 2 hours of exposure, I believe. And if it was at 110 decibels, woof, you just brought it down to roughly 80, 85 decibels. So you're in a much safer range. Now, that's one option. But if you want to listen to a concert, but not have that muffling effect that you get with a foam earplug, and I don't really get to hear what it sounds like because it's just muffled. Well, they have earplugs that are designed for musicians. This is an Etymotic earplug. I also have another one here from Foam. Both of them and many others like them are designed with the same principle. They have an acoustic filter design that allows the pressurization of the air and the frequencies to be reduced in a more linear fashion. So the low frequencies to the high frequencies are all lowered, so it's almost more like you're turning down the volume on life and just having a lower volume without having that muffled effect. They're not perfect, but they're very natural, and a lot of people swear by them and say that they can really make your concert sound great while getting it to a level that's a lot more tolerable and a lot safer. Now again, very, very loud concerts, that may not be sufficient to really truly prevent hearing loss. It might give you a better chance and you still can enjoy the music, but for average concerts in the low 100 decibel range, those would be sufficient while also retaining the ability to hear everything at a sort of a balanced way. So I highly recommend these. They're very inexpensive. You can get these for less than $20. The Etymotics are very reusable. I've used these for years at every concert I go to. They're very good. I even use them in other locations. I keep them in this Altoids tin. It's a small Altoids tin mini, or smalls I guess they call it. And they fit in there. I actually have 2 pairs in there in case my wife or someone needs a pair. And sometimes I've been in situations, I was at the fair recently where there was a tractor pull and we weren't watching it. We were at the other side with the rides walking through the food court and everything, but it was close enough that the tractor pull was insanely loud. And I pulled out my earplugs, put them in there, but instead of muffling things and making it hard to talk to people, it just kind of reduced everything in a balanced way, and I could keep having conversations. And you'll see the stem is transparent, and when it's in your ear, I mean, you can't really tell that I have anything in my ear, and even if you did, you'd probably just think it was a hearing aid or something. So very discreet, very compact. Highly recommend having them on you at all times. Again, hearing loss is kind of taken as this, oh, it's not a big deal, but statistically, as people age, they have more and more hearing loss. And I know people who have severe hearing loss, and I know people that have tinnitus. One of my favorite people in the world, my Uncle Stevie, has a great music collection, and he's exposed me to so much music. And in his later ages of his life, he started to get tinnitus, and it really detracted not only from his music enjoyment, but from his quality of life. And that's very sad. So I hope that we can take these principles and apply them so that we can preserve the hearing we have and prevent any kind of potential damage that we might experience like that, so we can enjoy a good quality of life and enjoy music the rest of our lives. So that's a concert. I want to talk next about shooting guns, firearms. So most guns start at about 140 decibels. Some guns can be louder than that, and it can be even more amplified by the acoustics of the environment you're in. If you're at a shooting range, shooting a firearm with concrete walls surrounding you and a concrete tunnel down to your target, you are creating a resonance chamber to amplify those gunshots. Now that gunshot might be very fast and sudden, but it's of such a velocity, such an amplitude. At 160, 180 decibels, you will have immediate and instantaneous hearing loss without ear protection. Now you might not notice it. It may not destroy your life. And in some cases, you might have a little bit of ringing and the ringing subsides, but there is hearing loss taking place there. If you continue to do that, you will have more and more severe hearing loss. Now remember the numbers that I talked about earlier. If a gun is at even 140 decibels, these are 33 to 34 decibels. That would only take the gun down to about 110, 105, 110 decibels. That is still beyond the threshold of hearing loss if you're shooting regularly enough. Now, you're not shooting one continuous sound for 2 hours straight, but still, it's cumulative. So over time, the more shooting you do, the more that hearing loss is going to build up. Now, the best thing that you can possibly do if you're into firearms and you're into shooting is to double up your hearing protection. Now, that means use earplugs like the Macks, which are 34 decibels, and then use ear muffs like a 3M or something that adds another 30, 35 decibels of hearing protection. That's about the max you can get. Most things kind of top out at around low 30s. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and I won't get into the science behind this, but stacking earplugs and ear protection does not accumulate twice the amount of protection. If you have a 30 decibel plug with a 30 decibel muff, you're not gaining 60 decibels of noise reduction. You're gaining about 35. The additional extra muff is only giving you about 5 decibels at most of protection. There's science behind that, but long story short, you're lucky if you can get close to 40 decibels of protection, and that's in a perfect situation, fully sealed. Everything fits very well, very nicely. Fit is very important when it comes to hearing protection. A seal with the earphones and a tight fit without any hair or eyeglasses or anything obstructing the seal of the earmuff. If you get that down, okay, so let's say best case scenario, you get 40 decibels reduction. And let's say you're shooting a 45 caliber pistol that's 180 decibels. That brought you down to 40 decibels lower, 140 decibels total. That's still practically instant hearing loss. Now again, with the short duration of a gun, you may not notice it immediately, but it is happening. So I highly recommend that if you're shooting, you do 2 things, maybe 3. First, double up your hearing protection. Second, use some sort of I forget what they call them, a muzzle or a suppressor on the firearm to reduce the noise coming out of the gun itself. If you can reduce that even by 10, 20 decibels with the double hearing protection, that can get you down to a threshold that is much more reasonable and would protect you for a very, very long time without hearing loss. Second thing, and this is a very important factor, your acoustic environment. Don't shoot in a gun range. Gun ranges are horrible for sound. Now, if you don't have access to anywhere else, okay, do the best you can to use your protection and whatnot. But if possible, go to an outdoor range with no concrete walls or walls and ceilings around you that would allow the sound to disperse. And you'd be amazed at the effect that can have on a gunshot. It can make the sound a much more manageable decibel level, so that double hearing protection gets it down to a preventable protection level. So shooting is frankly one of the most dangerous things for your ears. It's great, it's fun, but it's dangerous. So if you do that regularly, on a regular basis, it's absolutely critical that you double protect and you use good quality protection with a good seal and a good fit. If you're shooting occasionally and you can shoot outdoors and you can use good hearing protection, you're probably fine. But even in the best case scenario, if you shoot regularly and you're in a range, you may just accumulate hearing loss over the course of your life. How much it affects you particularly based on your ears, your genetics, your equipment, your gun, your acoustic environment, I can't say. But it's very likely, if not guaranteed, that continuous shooting will result in hearing loss. So take every precaution you can to minimize that to the most. Doesn't mean you can't shoot, but minimize that hearing loss so that maybe you can shoot for 30 years and have a very small amount of hearing loss, and by that point you're in your 80s. Okay, you're old anyway. Maybe you'd have genetic hearing loss, so it's not a big deal. But why would you want to risk your hearing loss so that when you're 60, 70, 80 years old, you have tinnitus and you have suffering of that constant ringing, and you affect your sleep and you affect your aggravation levels, and you can't listen to music anymore? Don't take that risk. Just protect yourself. It's serious. I'm just trying to stress that it's important that you're aware of these things. I don't want to be obnoxious, and I just care about you guys and your enjoyment of music. So I want to stress these things. So those are some situations where you have sound levels that are dangerous. There are other situations where they may not seem so dangerous at first, but over time they add up. Perhaps you work at a warehouse. Maybe you work in the loading dock at Walmart, and you're using a bunch of the lifts and using the jacks that you carry on pallets and things like that. Clanking those jacks, you may not think so, but that's a sudden metallic percussive sound that could be over 100 decibels. You clank, 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 moving things around all day, lifts going up, rah, rah, rah. It might be 90, 100 decibels even, depending on your proximity to it. Now, they're not constant noises, but they're constant enough throughout the day that if you work at this warehouse for 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, for years, you could be building up a lot of hearing loss. So something like the musician earplugs, at a minimum, you could get some comfortable musician earplugs that are discreet. No one really cares. No one notices them. And as you're working all day, they're not really interfering with anything. You can hear people talking, but at least they'll bring those things down to a more manageable level. Now, if you're in a loud enough warehouse, hopefully they provide you with proper hearing protection, and I recommend that you use that as well. But just something to keep in mind, an office, just a regular old work office. Generally speaking, they're not that loud, but perhaps you're in a specific office that has, a call center, and the cubicles just aren't very acoustically isolated. You might have 50 people talking all day long, and you may not realize that those people altogether accumulate to 85, 90 decibels. It's not too bad, but if you're there for a 10-hour shift, that might accumulate to a low-level amount of hearing loss. You may not notice it, but 20 years from now, you may start to find that it's a little bit harder to hear people when they're talking. Their speech is a little bit less intelligible. So just keep in mind, if you familiarize yourself with what sounds have what levels of loudness, and then kind of get an idea of how long certain levels of loudness are permissible before you start to have hearing loss, it's not as hard as you would think to just go throughout your day and say, ooh, that's dangerous. I need to protect my hearing. Ooh, that's a little bit loud. I'm just going to be cautious and maybe use my musician earplugs. Heck, you might say, oh, this is really, really dangerous. I don't have any earplugs, but I know I need to be careful. Let me plug my ears or stuff toilet paper or just do something to at least minimize the damage. And you'll be familiar with it and it'll be easier. So that pretty much sums up all I want to say about different sound levels and exposure and things like that. So hopefully that helps you and kind of gets you, maybe motivated to think a little bit more about it. So the last thing I want to talk about is just how does this all relate to music and just general hearing loss specifics. So with music, when you're listening to sound at a loud volume, there's a couple problems. One, your brain easily adapts to sound levels. So if you're the kind of person that feels like music's never really loud enough, believe it or not, it may just be that your brain has adapted and now you're craving a little bit more of that energetic feeling, so you turn it up. But then over a little bit of time, your brain adapts again, and then you're feeling like there's not that energetic feeling, you turn up a little more, and it's a vicious cycle, and you just keep turning up. Before you know it, you're getting hearing loss regularly. Problem also is that music is very frequency dominated. What I mean by that is there might be a song that has a strong amount of high frequencies. Some songs have a strong amount of bass frequencies. And when you turn up the overall mean average of the volume, it might be perceived as being a safe volume, but you may be getting a large spike or peak of a certain frequency that puts that frequency above the threshold. And then over time, you may be damaging that region of your hearing and not even really knowing it. So there's not much you can do if you're not familiar with frequency response and how songs are mixed and what to kind of perceive, but the best thing to do is to kind of keep the song at a very safe volume. I'm not saying you can't enjoy your music, you can't have it loud, but if you can familiarize yourself with what sounds are around 85 decibels, that's kind of that threshold where you really should be a little bit more careful, and you can kind of familiarize yourself with that amount of sound pressure, that level of sound, you can get pretty used to it, and you can start to know when something is around that level, and you can actually sense it, and then you can more easily prevent music and other things from going past that level. You'll be aware of it. You can kind of take precautions. When you're listening to music, there's a couple things you can do. First, as you're listening to music, just halfway through a song now and then, pause your music player. Take a couple seconds, listen, maybe 10, 20 seconds, kind of let yourself adapt, and then press play again. Bah! If that music comes in and it scares the hell out of you, it's too loud. Plain and simple. Now, if it's jarring and you go, oof, that's loud, but then like after a second or two, you're like, okay, it's not very loud. It was just kind of like the sudden jump seemed loud. It's probably not that bad. But if you're like, whoa, and you got to turn that down, yeah, you're listening to it too loud. That's just one quick test that can kind of shock you. Sometimes you don't realize it's so loud. But again, because your brain adapts, once you've adapted to the quiet, the threshold has kind of gone down, and then when you turn that music back on, you realize just how high up you had it. The second thing you can do is kind of get familiar with the sounds we talked about earlier, and just the sounds in the world, how loud they are. And then when you're listening to music, you can kind of compare them and say, oh, yeah, I enjoy it that loud, but I didn't realize it was 100 decibels. Maybe I need to cut that back 15 decibels and get used to it so that I can preserve my hearing. So just, be conscious of it, be aware of it, and do the best you can to familiarize yourself with how things sound in terms of volume. And you can kind of get used to that to the point where it's pretty easy to hear something and know, well, okay, I need to back it off a little bit. When you go to a concert, when you listen to it in an MP3 player, whatever it is, the tendency is to want to feel that visceral feeling, the bass, and hear the energetic, the transient attack, and that just really feel your music. But you want to make sure that you're not constantly pushing that boundary as you adapt. Try to force yourself to listen to it at a volume that you find is loud but comfortable, and then just leave it there. If not, even force yourself every now and then, maybe turn the volume down just a little bit. And if it doesn't do it for you, okay, put it back. But just kind of feel, you might be surprised sometimes that you might actually be able to lower the volume more than you think by adapting to the lower volume and going the other way. So a couple tips, but just be aware. I know I keep stressing that, but it is really about awareness, about familiarization, and about just taking those things that you've learned and applying them with earplugs, with avoidance, and just with general knowledge to prevent hearing loss. If you do that, you can have a long life with awesome enjoyment of music and other things. When you get older, typically you lose the ability to hear people speaking. Now, hearing loss can range between 2 kilohertz up until about 9 kilohertz, with that speech area being somewhere in the middle there. And those frequencies are the most common cause of issue, because when you don't hear those frequencies, speech becomes unintelligible, because that's where a lot of the speech frequencies lie, in that range 2 to 10 kilohertz, somewhere like that. And if those frequencies are diminished, you might still hear, but you're not able to hear people talking, and that can be incredibly frustrating, and it can lead to a lot of challenges in your life. So hearing protection can alleviate that to a great degree. You still might have genetic causes of hearing loss. You might have medication side effects. You might have physical damage. You might have trauma. There's other causes of hearing loss, but your hearing loss is usually caused by the old age having more and more exposure to sound. Over time, you have cumulative hearing loss from loud exposure to sound. So if you can minimize that now, later in life, you'll have better hearing, less distractions from symptoms like tinnitus, and you can enjoy your music and enjoy your quality of life. So I hope that you take this video and at least it makes you think about hearing loss. Think about maybe ways you could prevent it. And even if you don't think it's anywhere near as important as I do, maybe I could just convince you to take even a small step. Maybe just going to a concert now, you can get a pair of musician earplugs and at least help yourself minimize the worst case scenario. Or maybe you're shooting a gun and at least you think, oh, okay, I use hearing protection. Maybe I should double up and put some earplugs underneath. I hope I can entice you to do those things and just maybe protect a little bit more of your hearing. And I want all of us here, all of these people in my audience that love music, you're looking for this equipment and these headphones and these things to increase the sound quality because you want to enjoy it. You want to perceive all these little nuances and these differences. You need your hearing to be intact. You're better off buying a cheap amplifier and protecting your hearing than you are buying an expensive amplifier and destroying your hearing, because you're not going to be able to enjoy it. So take the time to put a little bit of precaution in place, and hopefully you can enjoy music for a long time to come. So I'll stop beating a dead bush, whatever the phrase is. But thank you guys for watching. If you've made it this far, really, I appreciate it. Please like this video, subscribe to my channel, check out my music. I have an album on my Sean Ivory page that I'll link to, and just, whatever you can do to get more subscribers and more view time here will help me to be able to put more time and effort into this channel, and I do appreciate that. As always, if you have any questions, please leave them below. Please leave them below. And as always, I thank you guys for watching. Peace.